And then I'm going to actually turn it over to our moderator for today's mock study section. Dr. Christina Howard from Research Development Services is here helping us out, and she is going to introduce the panel, and we'll get started. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. We have with us today Dr. Carolyn Cannon, who is Associate Professor in Microbial Pathogenesis and Immunology. Dr. Brett Mitchell, Associate Professor in Medical Physiology, and Dr. Rajesh Miranda, who is Professor in Neuroscience and Experimental Therapeutics. And today we're going to go through 3 different applications as a mock study section panel. So for the first application, the title is Autoantibodies and the Pathogenesis of Hypertension in Systematic Lupus Erythematosus. And Dr. Miranda was our primary reviewer. We could start with you and get the preliminary score, please.
I gave this a score of 2, which is high impact.
I was second reviewer and I gave it a 3.
Third reviewer, and I also gave it a 3.
Thank you. Now we'll open it up for discussion. If you could hit on some of the highlights and also some of the low points of the application.
So I obviously thought this was a high impact application. This is from a very talented individual seeking 2 years of funding for the postdoctoral training period. This person has quite a stellar history of engagement in research from undergraduate publications as an undergraduate to strong publication record as a graduate student, and is now in their first year of postdoctoral training in this new laboratory, and has already had 1 paper published and a couple of abstracts. This individual is currently on a T32 training grant, and we'll talk about that in a moment, which means that there is institutional support as well. So there's a lot of strengths about this individual. About the only thing that gave me a little bit of a pause, and for me made it not a 1, was that this, for a variety of reasons, this individual has chosen to remain in the same institution that she did her graduate training in as well.
If y'all are joining us by Zoom or from one of the other sites, if you can mute your mics, because we can hear like the background noise and the whispering, and that would help us hear everybody to be able to hear. Thank you.
One of the worries in a training plan that includes residents at the same institution is that you might lack the training that comes with exposure to new institutional environments. And that can be a really important component of the training. On the other hand, the applicant made a clear case for why that was not a feasible opportunity, and that is a believable case. And so I did not ding her a whole lot for that, because 2 is yet a pretty strong score. Nevertheless, even though staying in the same institution, the applicant will clearly get new training in the postdoctoral period. The applicant's background in graduate studies was in immunology, and she will take her immunology experience to the postdoctoral period to train now more in physiology, dealing with cardiovascular and renal consequences of lupus, which is, as you all may know, is an autoimmune disease. And she's training with a really talented mentor who's had a history of successfully training people, and they've gone on to their own careers and independent careers. So there's a track record here for the mentor as well. And the mentor has been productive, is clearly an expert in this area, and will serve as a good training support. Additionally, an interesting feature of this application, this is in a medical school context, and lupus has very obvious medical implications, of course. The mentor has assembled a training team, which includes physicians as well as basic scientists, and I thought that was an interesting component of this, the training team, to really focus on the clinical applications, the clinical implications of this research. The training plan, it was quite well outlined. It includes both training in experimental approaches and was based on a very sound hypothesis, sound preliminary data, actually very beautifully done preliminary data, which gave me a lot of confidence in that this training would go well. The basic hypothesis is that lupus is hard to treat because you can kill the B lymphocytes that create autoimmune diseases, but unfortunately, the long-lived plasma cells that continue to generate antibodies are not altered, and so this training plan would really focus on those long-lived plasma cells and how to manipulate them and their role in renal and cardiovascular function. So it was all very beautiful. As part of the training plan, also there was a good focus on things like developing mentorship and writing skills and such. So overall, the mentorship, the training plan, I thought was very strong. And given both the mentor's background and experience and the applicant, I felt that the training potential was also extremely strong. And lastly, just coming back to the institutional support, not only was there strong research infrastructure specifically that supports the applicant's interest in immunology and renal cardiovascular function, but also the fact that this applicant was in a T32 suggests that there's a kind of a vibrancy of research support, and that the institution believes in the applicant. So there is an institutional vested support in this applicant that speaks very strongly, not only for the institutional support, but for the quality of the applicant. And so overall, that's what drove my enthusiasm.
I gave it a 3 preliminary, so definitely in the top bucket. I thought the applicant was a 2. 8 first authored publications was outstanding. She had a pre-doc fellowship and has gotten all A's. So why not a 1? I don't know. But definitely a 2. The sponsor is outstanding. Has experience training people, so I gave him a 2. Training plan, I gave a 3. There was strong and supportive preliminary data, which was nicely summarized. Power analysis and stats were addressed, and expected results, alternatives were all addressed. I thought the science could have been a little more innovative. I think it's a very safe project. That's why I didn't score higher than a 3. The training potential, it was very clear what was new. So like you said, the immunology background, but applied to a new area. But very detailed, individualized sponsor plan was great, and the environment's outstanding. I gave it a 3.
So I also gave it a 3, and I agree with reviewers 1 and 2 with regards to all of the strengths. I gave the applicant a 1. I didn't find anything that I didn't like about this applicant. I thought it was an outstanding applicant. I gave a little bit of a ding to the sponsor, mostly for grantsmanship issues. So there were differences in the dates of the grants that were supposed to support this particular applicant listed in 2 different places in the application. Something to watch out for. I'm sure it's one or the other, or there was a renewal of a grant that he had listed previously as one set of dates that he forgot to update someplace else. I also gave a ding from a grantsmanship standpoint that this his training plan was clearly written for an AHA fellowship that then got incorporated in this grant. Forgot to update that and said, wow, this is the greatest AHA fellow ever. So these are just little details that don't take away from the training potential, which is why it's in the top bucket. So I gave great scores for all of the elements. The only one that I dinged down below the top bucket, which we're referring to as the 1 through 3, was the research training plan itself, which I thought was very elegantly laid out. But I had one issue, and that was that both aims 1 and 2 are relying on a model that is using a particular drug, bortezomib, in order to eliminate plasma cells. So this is a chemotherapeutic drug that's used to treat multiple myeloma and lymphoma, and it has multiple off-target effects. It's a proteasome inhibitor. And some of those off-target effects in patients happens to be hypotension. And what they're measuring and trying to link is lowering of blood pressure by removing plasma cells. I'm not sure that is the mechanism of the hypotension in the patients, but that bothered me a little bit that they didn't have an additional orthogonal look at how they were going to go about depleting that particular cell population instead of using a drug that potentially has several off-target effects. So that's why I listed that as a 4. Otherwise, I thought this was an excellent grant, and I really liked the candidate and the sponsor and the institution. So,
Wonderful. So thank you. To summarize the discussion, this is a very strong applicant with a good, strong publication record, an outstanding mentor, a few minor weaknesses identified, but overall, very strong training plan, high training potential, some weaknesses identified in the approach, but overall a good approach with a good hypothesis. And do you have anything to add to the summary? Could I get your, okay. And we have some additional scored review criteria. This applicant did have a vertebrate animal section.
That was
it was
Yeah, well done.
acceptable, very well done.
Okay, good. Could I get your final scores, please?
I think a 2 was a good score.
I'll stay at a 3.
I'm staying at a 3.
Wonderful, thank you. We will move on to the next application, which is entitled The Role of T Lymphocytes in Hypertension During Chronic Inflammatory Disease. And the primary reviewer for that was Dr. Mitchell. You could start getting your preliminary scores, please.
Gave it a 2.
I gave it a 4.
So my enthusiasm, since I'm the best scoring, the applicant is outstanding. So she had a master's degree from LSU Health Science Center, wants to be a tenured academic independent scientist. She studied alcohol intoxication in rats previously, now is looking at neuroimmune interactions in hypertension renal disease, so a new shift, a new field for her. Lists a number of fellowships and awards, and has already had some funding as a postdoc. 9 publications, 6 as first author in good journals, and the grades were good. So the applicant I gave 1. Sponsor I gave a 2, very strong, well-funded, well-published, experienced training postdocs. So I gave him a 2. Training plan, I thought this project was innovative. It was very clear the expected results. The limitations, alternatives were addressed. Power analysis was clean. So they actually have a mentoring advisory team that's going to meet every 2 months, which I thought was a little excessive, but I think overall it shows commitment, and it really conveyed why each person was selected for that mentoring team and what they're going to bring to the project and the training plan overall. He clearly lists out what is new, some molecular biology, immunobiology, the mentoring, get some teaching experience, really clearly laid out what's going to be new for this applicant. And the environment is outstanding.
So I agree with all of the strengths as delineated by reviewer number 1. I probably was a little bit more harsh on the fact that the applicant had C's scattered throughout her academic record at all levels of training. I don't ding somebody that has trouble figuring things out as a freshman, but I like to see a positive trajectory, and if there is a trajectory if it's a scatter diagram, then I'm not as enthusiastic about that. I thought that the primary sponsor was really an expert in the field and had plenty of support. However, at this point in time, the sponsor really had limited mentoring experience, having trained only 1 postdoctoral fellow who is now in a residency, so hadn't moved anyone into an academic position at this point. So that was mitigated by the mentoring team that reviewer 1 mentioned. But I personally would have liked to have had a co-sponsor with more mentoring experience that would be meeting with the student on a more regular basis rather than trying to get a whole group of people together every 2 months, which if you've tried to herd cats and faculty, it's the same issue. So I really would have preferred a different structure in terms of trying to augment the mentoring inexperience of the sponsor. I really liked the research training plan. I thought it was very well laid out based on rigorous preliminary data, and I didn't have any issues with it, although I wasn't as impressed with the power analysis. There was one that was mentioned briefly, but not actually displayed. So I probably dinged a little bit there. The only weakness that I saw in the training potential here is that this particular postdoctoral fellow had been in the lab for 2.5 years already at the time of this application. And so even though they did a very nice job of delineating what new skills this individual would learn, there was a chunk of what was being proposed that she already was very facile with. So that limited the training potential a little bit for me. I thought the institution was excellent, and that's why I maintained in the high bucket. It's a good score, but it wasn't a perfect score for me.
Okay, so one of the things that I should mention in this for this particular application is that it's a revised, resubmitted application.
It's my fault. I should have mentioned that. So this was a revised application.
And so I agree with actually both first and second reviewer, and I would tend to kind of fall more towards the second reviewer in my evaluation of both the applicant and the mentor for the exact reasons that the second reviewer mentioned. When I look at revised and resubmitted applications, I pay attention to the way that the applicant has addressed the reviewer concerns raised in the previous submission. And one of the reviewer concerns had to do with quality of the data. And to some extent, trying to understand how much of this is really preliminary data that was provided, and how much of it was well-established data. And in the original application, standard deviations and things like that, and sample sizes were not given. This one does improve that in terms of providing preliminary data. So there are some data pieces which have an N of 2 and all, which is just fine. I mean, that is preliminary data that suggests feasibility. But there's also continues to be data that's presented, and one of them is a photomicrograph that had really no explanation, no details. The arrows didn't appear to be pointing to the right portions of, so they were pointing to talking about blood vessels, but it looked like the arrows were pointing to renal tubules and things like that. And I felt there was enough indication of a level of sloppiness in the presentation that I worried about the training plan. And so I would rate the applicant and the mentor as about a 3, but I felt like the training plan was about a medium, and that in turn impacted my assessment of training potential. And again, a medium is a pretty decent place. We're not talking terrible, right? So that made me go to the edge of 4.
All right, thank you. So in summary, this is an outstanding applicant who is branching out into a new field of study, has awards, has had previous funding, has a good publication record, and a strong sponsor, although there are some minor weaknesses identified with that. Namely that the sponsor does not have a track record of moving postdocs into faculty positions. This is somewhat mitigated by having the training committee that plans to meet every 2 months. It's an innovative project. It's clearly laid out what's new in the project. There were some concerns with the overall approach, particularly with addressing the reviewer concern on some of the preliminary data.
I didn't ding the weaknesses as much. So being a revised application, I felt the applicant addressed the issues. Yes, the previous concern was the experience of the mentor. So I tended to score.
Thank you.
I'll stay at a 2.
Okay.
Are we ready for final scores?
Well, we do have to discuss the vertebrate animal section.
That was fine.
That was fine.
Yeah.
Good. And one thing that we did not discuss on the previous application was the responsible conduct of research training, any research sharing plan or budget. Those are not scorable items, but it is important to do them well.
RCR was well done in this one.
Very well.
Excellent. So could I have your final scores, please?
I'll go down to a 3.
I'm staying at a 3.
I think I could go to a 3.
Thank you.
The one thing I did want to point out in this application, and just something to be a little careful about, so all of you have the abstracts, I think, of the application. And just remember, the project summary is something that is public. And the readers you've got to think about who reads these project summaries. It could be congressional aides, it could be the public who wants to know. And so this thing has to be written very carefully to be understandable to anybody. And I just want to read a line here. In addition, there is a rightward parallel shift in the chronic pressure natriuresis relationship and increased renal vascular resistance and renal vascular sensitivity. I have no idea what this sentence means, and of course when you read it and you get into it, but it requires a level of understanding. So just one thing I saw that and I wanted to point out: avoid jargon. It may be in your field, but like a reviewer like myself, I'm no expert in this. So that line just made no sense to me. So just watch.
Just a note, I printed all the other handouts. I did not print the project summaries.
Okay.
But those were emailed out to everyone who registered for the event. If you are just a walk-in, just email me and I will send those on to you.
Thank you. We'll move on to our final application for today. And the title of that application is Bacterial Regulation of Host Endomembrane Trafficking. And our primary reviewer is Dr. Cannon.
Preliminary score of 5.
Second one? 5.
I gave it a 4.
So as an aside, this would fall in the bottom third of the grants that we're reviewing today. So generally speaking, it would fall below the discussion line and we wouldn't be talking about it. But we're going to pretend that someone has rescued it, because someone can rescue any grant, no matter where it falls, no matter what the scores are, for whatever reason. And so I'm rescuing this grant. Not that I would have, but I am. All right, so I'm going to show you what a more formal presentation that I typically do at a study section sounds like. I like to get specific so people understand what the score driving aspects of this were. It's not going to take longer. This 3-year F32 application addresses the hypothesis that E. coli secreted protein G, ESPG, targets a conserved eukaryotic regulatory and signaling pathway to disrupt normal cellular function during bacterial infection. The applicant has demonstrated productivity with 2 first authored and 2 co-authored publications, including a co-authored publication in Nature in his current laboratory. Additionally, has given several invited presentations, hold leadership positions in the postdoctoral association. He has supported letters of recommendation, and his sponsor states that he's hardworking, focused, committed, and engages his scientific colleagues with remarkable inquisitions. I thought that was interesting. And he clearly aims for a career as an independent investigator. The primary sponsor is an expert focused on the topic at hand. He has published in high impact journals, Cell Science, Nature, and is funded through the duration of the proposed project. And the research training plan, the applicant proposes 2 aims, and both of them have detailed descriptions, expected results, limitations, and alternate approaches. During an actual study section, we would talk about what those aims are, but you don't have the grant, so I'm going to skip over the actual what they are. The training plan provided by the sponsor is detailed, personalized, and will provide the applicant with new knowledge and skills in host-pathogen interaction. The applicant will train on several different new techniques, one of which he's pioneered in the lab so that they hadn't performed this technique previously, portive light and electron microscopy. Additionally, the plan will enhance the applicant's mentoring and communication skills, and I thought that the institutional environment was superb. So what were the score driving weaknesses that resulted in my giving this application a 5? So from the applicant's standpoint, he only provided his graduate academic record, which is even mix of A's and B's that wouldn't bother me, but it was a very brief list of anything. So one might presume based on his productivity that it doesn't matter. but to me, it just looked a little lazy, and there will be a theme in that regard. So from the sponsor standpoint, despite that this sponsor is on a upward rocket trajectory in terms of prominence, the sponsor has only published 25 papers total, and this is the very first postdoctoral trainee. None of his PhD trainees have completed the work in his lab to allow assessment of mentoring provided by the sponsor. And so my assessment was that a senior co-sponsor with proven mentoring experience would enhance the training potential of the project. So even if you have, sorry?
12:25. I wanted a warning.
Gotcha. So even if it's a fabulous sponsor, but is junior, assistant professor, it's worth having a senior mentor as part of the grant. So with regards to the research training plan, this is one of my personal pet peeves that I'm sharing. So not every reviewer looks at things this way, but the applicant wrote the proposal primarily in the first person plural, and only until relative contribution section was it possible for me to dissect out who performed the preliminary studies. So I had no idea if this was stuff taken from the lab, which is perfectly fine. There's no problem with that, because there is no preliminary data that is required using the applicant's own hands in a training grant. But if you want to say that you've done some cool new thing in the lab, you have to actually say somebody else did this, and this graph is attributed to this person, and I did this, and this is attributed to me. And if I have to dig for it as a reviewer, it doesn't make me happy. And your job to write is to make your reviewer happy. There was also no description of the quantitative analysis of images, because a good deal of preliminary data had to do with images, nor of statistical analyses compared to any sort of controls. And the only control that was provided with regards to one of the images was clearly not an image that the applicant took at the same time as made more sense if you knew the science, but I'm trying to be general here. And so I didn't have any way to assess how this could come up with a quantitative result, that this was purely descriptive. Cool images, but descriptive. In terms of the training potential, the training plan provided by the applicant is brief to the point of uninterpretable. That's how he lists his activity as 100% research. That's his activity list, which was completely unlikely given, for example, his leadership positions that he held in the postdoctoral association. So he clearly was doing administrative stuff, mentoring other people in the lab. This was no idea what the training potential of this was, and that's really where my major ding was training potential. Similarly, the applicant notes that he is already highly proficient in the techniques that the sponsor states are new to him. So there was a disconnect. Sponsor says he's going to learn to do all this stuff, and the applicant says, hey, I can do all of this already, which means that the training potential, which is what we're supposed to be evaluating as reviewers, is low if the applicant thinks he's already good at it, which may not necessarily be the case given the grant. Didn't mention any attempts to improve communication skills, despite the evidence that he wasn't clear on what it took to put together a fundable grant. So that also underscored the mentoring issue that I was concerned about to begin with, because if the mentor had looked at the training plan provided by the applicant, then it would look like the nice training plan that the sponsor clearly wrote himself. The institution was great. Yay. So I gave that a 1.
Okay, so that was a very thorough description, and I agree heartily with everything. Just a couple other issues. I think the one of evidence of a lack of sponsor interaction with the applicant is the heavy jargon that was used to explain the grant. And again, often these grants are reviewed by people who are not experts in the field, and it talks about a type 3 mechanism, again in the summary statement, without explaining why is that different from type 1 and type 2. So I thought the focus on jargon, and then what I would describe as a focus on look-see science. We're going to look and see what happens, with very little emphasis on trying to dissect mechanistic underpinnings, and that's about all that I'll add. but I agree with everything you said.
I gave it a 4. I was a little more high on the applicant. I agree the sponsor's 4 years out of his postdoc. That's a concern. It really is a fishing expedition. It was not hypothesis driven, so that really kills the training plan. And training potential is dead in the water. He already has done membrane, biochemistry, protein. He's already done everything, and now is just looking at the exact same stuff in bacteria. That was the only thing new in this applicant. So I was generous with the 4.
Okay. To summarize the discussion here, this is an applicant from a very strong institution with a mentor who's on an upward rising path. However, there's are concerns about some pretty major aspects of the project, which diminished overall enthusiasm for this applicant, including some lack of or concerns about training potential, lack of communication between the mentor and the applicant about aspects of the training plan. There were some moderate weaknesses identified with the overall approach and some of the data analysis. It's not as clear what is new or what the training benefit will be from this proposal. And could we get do you have any additional comments to add to the overall summary?
I thought there was an over-reliance on core labs as well. It seemed to be, I'm going to give it to this core and they're going to do it, and he's not going to learn how to do anything. So that was one addition.
There were no vertebrate animals. Could we get a comment on the responsible conduct of research?
This was very deficient, I felt. in this.
Unacceptable is how yes. So wasn't able to comment on exactly the duration of the contact time with in-person and frequency was not commented upon at all.
Whether it was faculty, just everything.
Lots of issues.
It was as pithy as the training plan provided by the applicant.
Thank you. Could we get your final scores?
I will stay at a 5.
Just you were so eloquent. I might go to a 6.
I would go up to a 5. Definitely.
Thank you, everyone. Before we open it up for Q&A, I have one question for the panelists, and then we'll take all of your questions as well. So if each of you could identify one or two of the primary features of a proposal that makes you want to advocate for that proposal and to discuss it in a study section discussion, and then also identify one or two common issues that diminish your overall enthusiasm for that proposal. And as you've seen, this can bring the overall score of an application down during the discussion.
A well-written proposal really helps. So one of my mentors said that there's no good writing. There's only good rewriting. And so don't wed yourself to each paragraph as you put it on a page. Have somebody else look at it. Because if it's clean and it's easy to understand, then it's a lot easier to form a positive opinion. If I don't understand what's going on, I might miss a point that would mitigate a concern that I have. But if I don't understand what you're writing about, so that I think is really critical. Do it far enough in advance that you can get somebody else look at it and edit. The other thing that goes along with that is that I think I've mentioned congruence between, in these fellowship training plans, what the sponsor says and what you, the applicant, would be saying. So you come up with what your goals are, and I like to see them addressed. 1, 2, 3, 4. What are you trying to get out of this in terms of competencies or whatever word you want to use it? So I want to improve my communication skills. I want to improve my teaching skills. I want to improve my critical thinking skills. If you put that one first, I really like that. Just saying. So come up with a framework for how you're going to insert all of the different activities that are going to lead to improvement of the competencies that you're trying to gain. And then put them in a timeline so that I, the reviewer, understand that you are addressing all of these points and there is a high training potential. Because high training potential is what puts you in the top bucket and gets funded.
That's what I was going to say. our SROs ingrained in our brains training potential. If you got a Nature paper and you propose to do the exact same mechanisms in your application, it's dead. So highlight, make it perfectly clear, bold, underline what is new. What have you done before and what is new? And does that fit with where you want to go? Okay, so that has to be clear and consistent throughout. This is my training potential. Here's who and how I'm going to get there. So you got to think, be a little selfish, but really highlight the training potential.
Very eloquently said, both of them. The only thing that I would say is kind of the flip side of the coin is the only thing you really have control is over your own trajectory, your own behavior. And you can be very systematic and thoughtful about how you're going to move from one stage to the next. And sometimes that comes across. And if you have a clarity of thinking in your own mind, you know where you want to be. That'll come across in your proposal, and then that speaks to the training plan. So what drives me often is the applicant first and foremost. Do they have a sense of where they want to be?
And I think one thing that we didn't mention, but Dr. Mander just touched on, is trajectory past this grant. So one of the pieces that I didn't talk about was path to independence, because these are postdoctoral grants, and the expectation is that this is going to launch you either to a second postdoc, which you can tell them is what you want to do in order to gain another set of skills potentially, or to your first faculty position. And it's really nice, and we didn't talk about it, but some of the sponsors had a path to independence section in the sponsor statement, and I really like to see that. From the reviewer standpoint, it's helpful if the sponsor is even explicit with, this is a technique that this person developed, or this is a model that this person developed, or this person is looking at a slightly different thing than is mainstream in the lab, and they're taking it with them. This is how their career will be built. And that's mentoring. If I see that, then I put the mentor in the top bucket, because that is what the job of the sponsor is to help the applicant move to the next stage. And if the applicant then talks in their statement about, after this I plan to write a K, for example, then I see that this person is seriously considering what the next step is. I like to see mention of individual development plans, these kinds of things, because it means that someone has sat down to really map things out. You can't, predict the future. No one has a crystal ball. Things change. But you have to have a plan A. We all understand that you might end up doing plan B, but you have to have a plan A. If I don't see a plan A for path to independence, then it's not as exciting.
Okay, thank you. We'll open it up to everyone for your questions, or if there's anyone from a remote location that has a question also, please feel free to ask. Yes.
Where does the recommendation letter come into discussion?
So I mentioned in my formal-ish review that the recommendation letter, that they were highly supportive. We didn't actually have the recommendation letters for these grants, so we kind of underemphasized that, but it's an excellent question. A good recommendation letter can change everything. And I'll make an example. Sometimes so one of the comments about one of these sponsors was about one of the applicants who had 2 children during her 2.5 years so far in the lab. So that basically subtracts at least a year off of productivity. And that changes the way I look at it. Some applicants and sponsors don't put it in the body of the grant, and that kind of information comes out in a letter of recommendation that absolutely changes the way people think about it. People can get funded based on very strong letters of recommendation.
Would you say generally is a positive when you know about extenuating circumstances?
Absolutely.
But a generic letter
Yeah.
won't help you, but a bad letter will ding you. So that's my 2 cents. Don't ask for a letter from someone who you don't know well. If they're just gonna write a generic letter, that's kind of a red flag. And also missing letters. So if you don't have one from your PhD mentor,
Red flag.
red flag, big time.
One thing you might ask when you're asking for these letters is, do you think you can give me a good letter? Or, you know,
Not will you write me a letter, will you write me a good letter?
yeah.
And help your letter writers. So give them, I usually ask for the training plan, the biosketch, specific aims if the rest of the science isn't written yet. So I have an idea of what you're trying to do and how this fits, into the rest of your career trajectory. And then help me with exactly what dates it is that I'm supposed to have known you so that it's congruent again, right? Because I might not remember what month you came into the lab, but I remember you. But if someone has one thing that's different from someplace else, it's just a red flag. And it shouldn't be. These are simple things.
Mm-hmm.
So give your letter writers information. Tell them what you want them to say. Even draft it if you want to give them an outline of what your science is so that they have an intelligent way to discuss it. The easier you make it for them to write you a good letter, the better.
Excellent. Other questions?
I've actually got a question about PIs versus co-chairs. Would a recommendation from a co-chair possibly be something that would be looked at equivalently to a PI's recommendation if you had to choose?
People will be looking for your primary mentor's letter. And if you don't get a letter from your primary mentor, there needs to be an explanation that the reviewers understand, or otherwise it's going to be a red flag. But there are lots of explanations that people can understand. Just as an example, some of my MD PhD students had a primary mentor who is now permanently in Italy, and it happened precipitously. So that would be, an explanation, for example, that I was unable to obtain a letter of recommendation from a mentor who is no longer at the institution.
I've seen one where there was a falling out between the student and the mentor, and the chair wrote one on the applicant's behalf, just explaining the situation. So it's clarity. As long as you know why and who that's important. Missing and not explain very well, that's red flags to us. We have to read between the lines and say, why isn't there a letter? If you have someone else writing a letter and explaining that covers.
Other questions? I have one on. Oh,
Yes.
question? Yes.
Yes.
And
So,
then there's one from there as well.
can you give us some tips about how would you balance an application in terms of how you show how innovative it is versus not making it seem like a fishing expedition? Differentiating between a safe project versus, not. You want it to be innovative, but then you don't want it to sound like a fishing expedition.
For F32s and even American Heart or little foundation grants, they tell us it's 1/3 applicant, 1/3 environment, 1/3 science. So we are not critiquing the science like we would in R01 or R21. So the science can be safe. It can be the next logical step as long as it's congruent with the training plan and the training potential. If I want to learn these skills, are those skills involved in the project? So I've seen one where the person was an expert in cell culture, went to this new lab to learn animal physiology, and guess what? The whole project was doing cell culture. That doesn't fit. So the exact science isn't as important as what are you going to get out of that project?
The focus should be on the new training. And the word is training, not necessarily science.
So the piece of the science that is important, and I think we touched on it, has to do with critical thinking, rigor, reproducibility. Does it look like you've thought about the alternative approaches and the statistical analysis and thinking about where you would present these data when you're talking about improving your communication skills at an appropriate meeting and doing the science thing in general. But there's not an innovation section, for example, in an F-series grant. We don't judge based on innovation. And honestly, it's nice if your first authored publication is in Nature, as mentioned with this last one, but it doesn't in any way have to be. It just has to be good science. And we all know that good science is published all over the place, as well as, top tier journals that with papers that, aren't the best. So I don't look at that except to say that in a lot of the labs that publish in those kinds of journals, they have potentially at their fingertips a lot more of the cutting edge techniques which can improve the training potential, right? That's where that might be a plus.
I think there was a question.
I'm curious about the reasons people would rescue a grant from the not discussed pool. Like what are the reasons that?
If you did 5.5 and I gave it a 2 because I really thought it was innovative and a great applicant, I would rescue it so that it got discussed in hopes that I could persuade them to come down from a 5. If I feel strongly about it 2 and I really want to advocate for it. Now we would have gotten each other's critiques beforehand and I could look ahead and read their comments that they presented here and they said, here are all the weaknesses, and I look at mine and say, oh, you're right, there are a lot of weaknesses, then I wouldn't rescue it. I would just let it pass by. It's not discussed, I'm fine with that. If I really want to advocate for it, I'm going to save it, discuss it, and really try and convince them why their weaknesses aren't such a big deal, and here are all the strengths, because I'm going to fight for it and try and get it a better score.
So some of the reasons also have to do with experience and expertise that differs in the panel. So I haven't actually ever rescued something from below the line, but what I have done is similar and rescued a grant from not getting funded by convincing people that their score should be better. And part of that has to do with who writes F32s. So you all are postdocs more than likely, but in that same cohort are clinical fellows. So individuals that went from undergrad to medical school to residency and are now having their first slice of research as a fellow, potentially. And that's a different experience. But some of the individuals on the panel that might not recognize that the fact that they don't have 3 first authored publications in, science journals don't recognize what that path looks like and how impossible that might be. And so sometimes I'll advocate for a grant because I think that the applicant has been compared apples to oranges. So I need to kind of tell them why this is an orange and a fabulous orange.
What you'll see on committees a lot is that discrepancies arise sometimes because of the level of experience of committee members. And oftentimes, junior committee members are more attuned to the science. And it tends to be that the more senior ones are more attuned to people. And so you'll get, I don't know if that's a fair thing, but you'll get a really careful dissection of the training plan from the scientific perspective. And there could be a lot of flaws, but if you look at that applicant's trajectory, and their environment and things like that, those things could be balanced out. So if you judge that the critiques are valid but nevertheless balanced out, then I think it's valuable to fight for that.
I also like to start my formal reviews with this is a how many year project. And it may be obvious, but when you frame what they're planning to do with the timeline that they're planning to do it in, then that can really change the perception of a training potential. Because if this is a 1-year project, they're not going to 10 conferences, right? They never get anything done. And so I like to try to calibrate apples and apples. Again, it comes back to that same thing, that sometimes people have a higher expectation, forgetting that this is, for example, a resubmission, and that's a year later from when the first submission. So this is a shorter project. So they had 3 aims the first time, but I like to see that they've completed aim 1 in a resubmission potentially, and have whittled it down to 2 aims because they now only have 2/3 the time that they were asking for to begin with. These kinds of things. How to keep it, what they're saying is going to happen in perspective.
The 3 of us have put together strengths and weaknesses for each of the 5 categories. So hopefully you heard us talk about applicant sponsor, training plan, training potential, and environment. So we've put together a bulleted list of strengths and weaknesses that we consistently see. And Stacy has that and can send it out if you don't have that. But if there's no more questions, I'm gonna hit on weaknesses under applicant. Now, we all think everyone's awesome, and especially at the trainee level, we want to encourage trainees to stay in science. But the red flags we see are a low number of abstracts and papers, low grades and test scores, no previous funding or fellowship, kind of a minor weakness. The career goals are general or inconsistent, and the letters of support are generic and not individualized. So those are the consistent applicant, why we would ding and drop our score on that. And we're instructed to start at a 5. So an average applicant, we start at a 5 rating. Now, these weaknesses I'm pointing out so you can address these now in terms of a workshop. So if we see a lot of these, we're going to go under a 5. If we see the opposite of these, conversely, good grades, good letters, then we're going to move up. So that we're on a sliding scale, but we're supposed to start at a 5. And if you don't show these weaknesses, we're going to move up. So do you have that sheet?
Yes.
You want to address sponsors?
Sure. So I think we talked about some of the things that make for a good sponsor. We want to see the mentoring experience, and we want to see productivity and grant support, and a training plan that is individualized for that particular individual. The weaknesses include junior sponsor with no experience training postdocs. So we heard about that with one of these grants. A senior co-sponsor, but with no clear involvement. So this is a paper co-sponsor, right? Just padding the grant isn't going to help. It has to somehow be a real relationship. Lack of advisory mentoring team are just listed without explanation, and lack of expertise from the assembled mentors. But the project needs someone with that expertise. So if there is a particular aspect of the project that is a little bit off topic for the lab, and there's no one listed to provide the expertise to help train in that area, that's a ding.
Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about the training plan. So the first thing to remember is that a training plan is not the same as your experimental, the set of experiments that you're planning to do. It is more than that. It's the things that are going to teach you to become a scientist. So just remember that includes things like attending conferences, writing papers, learning grant writing skills, mentorship skills. All of those things are considered to be part of the training plan. And if your application is deficient in those, even if your science is really good, that's a deficiency, because we want to train thinkers and planners, not just doers. Right? And in terms of your actual specific scientific training, the things that we want to see are evidence that you will learn to do science rigorously, that you will always be thinking about controls, about power, about statistical approaches, alternative interpretations, all of those things. That's much more important than what you actually are planning to do. Having said that, what you're planning to do should be feasible within time frame, within the expertise of this institution surrounding you, within your own skill sets, and so on and so on.
Training potential, the biggest red flags we see are unclear what is new. Again, we hit on that quite a bit. The sponsor and mentoring team provide generic training experience. Highly individualized stuff is what we want to see. The project and training plan doesn't fit the applicant's career goals. So if you want to go work in pharma and you have no farm-related connections or experiences if proposed, then that's a disconnect. Inconsistencies between the applicant and the sponsor. Dr. Cannon hit on that quite a bit. The proposed project includes skills that the applicant already knows how to do. So again, we're looking for very clear, bold, upfront, what is new to this.
And then thinking about the institutional environment, generic training resources and experiences, letters of support not tailored to the applicant or not there, and lack of resources. So if you need a core, it's not there. That's a problem. And one of the things that for me is a bit of a ding as well is that if the institution has a T32 support for this particular graduate program and this particular applicant isn't on it, then that's a disconnect for me too. Because if you bother to talk about it, then there has to be a reason why you weren't chosen. It doesn't have to do with the fact that your institution doesn't think that you're worthy of that slot. So don't put it in there if there's a T32 and you're not supported on it. These sorts of things, I think, are an issue from the institutional standpoint.
And just to add something from the institutional standpoint, one of the things that I just want to make clear is that A&M actually is a very, very good place. We have phenomenal resources. We have phenomenal support mechanisms. You just have to know about it. But don't assume that the others will know about it. And even like I've reviewed grants from Ivy League institutions, and they don't assume that everybody knows what resources are available at Harvard, for example. You can see a very, very extensive institutional section with all of the commitment that is available. So don't take that for granted, and A&M can really help in this respect. Don't ignore vertebrate animals. There are 4 sections that you have to address. Those have to be. Don't ever use the space for vertebrate animals to pack in stuff that you couldn't fit in your page limits of your grant proposal. That gets people really mad. If you have sample sizes and power analysis and all this sort of thing in there, because you couldn't fit in your, that is one of the big red flags. Biohazards, again, we sometimes don't think about these things, but in a training grant, they want to know that you're going to be safe in this practice. And so a lot of us do things like use AAVs and things like that, and we say, oh wait, but that's a BSO1, why do I need to worry about it? Not entirely true. If you're proposing to put in a load that is, say, oncogenic or is a toxin or something like that, right away that becomes a higher level of containment. Or if you're going to grow these as high titers, if you're making them in your lab, so don't assume that people will just give you a pass on that. That could be a deal breaker. There is not evidence that you can be safely trained too. So just in terms of that.
Resubmission. The first one we reviewed got funded on its first try. So that's very rare. The second one we scored was an A1. On your resubmission, be sure you address the comments of previous reviewers. You have one page only to address the previous comments. Don't dismiss any of the comments. Don't say they were stupid comments, stuff like that. So you want to acknowledge that, yes, this grant is made stronger by the previous reviews. Be sure you incorporate those changes. So you don't visually show where the changes are anymore, but on that one page introduction, you need to address what you've done, how you've added that, how you address that concern. Weaknesses is not addressing all of the comments or dismissing them or not responding to them in the resubmission. So be sure you do that. We are not allowed to say, I reviewed this in the previous study section. We're not allowed to say that anymore. We're not supposed to say what score I got previously. So all the reviewers in the room are to just judge and score the grant in front of us. So really, we are relying on how did you address the previous concerns. Now, if I reviewed it previously, I can kind of subjectively say, okay, these were some of the concerns of the reviewers before, and I can't say me, but they addressed these really nicely or they didn't, and that really influences the score. Just because it's a resubmission, the score does not automatically have to improve. The SROs will try and get the same reviewers, but more than likely you're going to have one or two new sets of eyes, and they are judging the grant as it is. Just because it's an A1 doesn't mean they have to improve the score. So.
And just to be aware for resubmission, the reviewer has the grant in front of them and the summary statement, but not the previous grant. So your one page is going to be addressing all of the comments that the reviewers have. So they will see what those comments are. And it's really important, I just want to underscore, really important to address the comments, because I have seen in a re-review of a resubmission that individuals on the review committee disagree with the comments that were made by a previous reviewer, but credit the applicant for having addressed them in a way that that particular person doesn't like, but still give them credit for that and not ding them on the score. So it's more important to be responsive than it is necessarily to make the person that's looking at a resubmission like the grant personally. And then we had several other things that we were mentioning. The RCR training, we've handed out a template that I pulled off the web from Stanford that I handed all of my students that asked for help with this. The reason that I like that template is that it is exactly the template that we as reviewers are supposed to fill out, and we're required to fill out all of these elements of your RCR training. And so if you do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which is exactly 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that the reviewer has to fill in, and it's all there, done. Happy reviewer. It's not a scoreable criteria, but if it's not there, then it's noted.
And the grant will be held up until that's addressed.
Exactly.
Just one thing I would like to add to the issue of resubmissions: don't ever be combative. You cannot win a fight with reviewers. And the one worst example I remember in study section was in the response to the reviewers, this individual said, "I cannot wait for an apology from the reviewers." And you should have seen how when the reviewer doing the review read that to the rest of the committee, and everybody was kind of semi-dozing off, but everybody got it, and everybody started pulling the grant to read that grant, which let's put it this way, didn't make things any better. Don't be combative. You just.
And the other point is, the applicant's still waiting. He's still waiting for that apology. It's never happening. It's just not happening.
Thank you for this discussion. Do we have any final questions before we wrap this up?
I've actually got a question regarding Texas A&M institutional resources. So is there anyone who handles these resources for, I know that the med school is now part of the overarching Texas A&M Health Science Center is now incorporated, but is there any institutional body that handles this that we should go to?
There is not, but that's something that I would ask that your mentor should take some trouble to understand. Like Texas A&M, for example, has probably the second largest student body in the country. We have more graduate programs than most other institutions. So there's institution and environment to support graduate and postdoctoral training is high. You look at the libraries, our library expenditures far exceed most institutions in the United States. Think about all of those things. Those are critical infrastructure issues. Our supercomputing resources are enormous. You guys get that for the asking for free. That is enormous. Just all of these things, but you should take a little time to find out. And I can certainly help you if that's.
But to your point, there isn't a single web page where you can punch resources and get a list of all of the core facilities, all of the everything that you would like to be able to cut and paste. Here's a description of all of these different resources around campus. That's a wish list.
I think to clarify, sorry, a point of clarification, just I'm referring more to related to grants, things related, because you mentioned there are institutional T32s and other institutional grants that if an applicant is making it, they should go through that resource. Is there a specific resource that people should go
That
through?
outlines training grants, not on campus. There are on, there are a
Or
couple.
postdoctoral grants?
Yeah.
If you
The
would like,
VPR office, yeah.
if you have a specific grant related question and you'd like to email me, you are more than welcome to do so. I will do my best to point you in the right direction, and if I don't know the answer, we don't have it in our office, I can probably find it for you on campus. So Stacy has my contact information,
Yeah,
so
so
feel free.
Christina works for Research Development Services, which is an office under the VPR's office for TAMU, and they help faculty develop their grants. They're not, postdocs are not their main, I don't know what to call that, but she can help or she can lead you in the right direction. So they do try to open their workshops and stuff up to postdocs.
Definitely, and we do let Stacy know so that she can email all of you when we have a workshop or something that we're doing where postdocs are welcome to attend as well.
And on our postdoc calendar online, I add all of their workshops that are open to postdocs. That's on my website. Easy to get to. Just Google postdoc calendar HSC, and you'll find that. And I always have those posted on there. So.
Absolutely. Well, we are out of time, but thank you very much to everyone for coming. We could give our three panelists a round of applause.
Stick around and answer any individual questions.
And for anyone that didn't register and didn't get the handouts, I didn't print very many today. So if you want to just come up to me and give me your email address, I'll get them for you.
Are you supposed to be the one who will spend some time?
You are the only participant.
I didn't want to.
I'm just trying to agree to it.
And then I'd already said I would do the second one. I was like,
I think everyone's great.
Well, I heard.
It's half an hour.
I heard these things.
and then I ended up like, oh, I'm not going to have one thing, but then I ended up writing it. Outline of exactly the same thing.
I know.
Thank you for doing it.
Actually, one of your birthdays. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, my name is
No, that's time. She made like a fish.
The way that I'm thinking about this cake.
Oh boy. It took her like almost like to sign it. Thinking like combined things.
Everybody, it's just great.
I never made one for Hannah. I never made
She
one.
writes
Well,
protocol.
be sure to have a sponsor write a portion of the sponsor statement.
She
And that is often.
Yeah, she peer reviewed herself.
Sure.
You are her men reviewer. No, that cake will go.
There are meetings that have
The cake will go.
think about it, maybe, or some other indication of relationships.
Oh, I thought because you didn't like
Are they here at A&M? They are, okay, that makes it easier.
Every other criteria we went through is the same for definition.
We don't have one for
Don't require publications.
Yeah,
Good,
awesome.
yeah.
Perfect. That's fine.
Doesn't matter.
Training potential.
What's my idea?
Right, so we're a training environment, so it shouldn't be new if we're going to train you.
Don't say
We just made up.
you should say we'll be involved in these ways. Whether it needs to be
What do you want me to tell you, Rose?
I think I'm gonna pick. I'm sure there are so many people who
right in that portion. The same thing. Make sure.
I don't think
So they're saying they're gonna come to that means we're gonna meet every 6 months.
Sponsors, they've been asked to sponsor, which means grant support, number of pages, how they are going to contribute to your training.
still watering.
Oh yeah, so that means there is a problem. That was her only innovation that I saw.
No, I'm trying to. I always make cakes for everyone.
So this is part of why I have to sponsor. And part of the sponsor something specific. The event sponsors are the first cycle, and I was supporting students.
These are
And so that you're responsibility for you.
Your mic is linked.
Okay, that makes sense.
Add stuff to
But it has to also specifically say that the sponsor is willing to write it down. They have right. And then your credit with all of that. And then that doesn't get taken against your sponsor.
I remember vanilla.
No, I couldn't do because my verse
Again, that would be.
But there isn't one for anybody.
and mine
I'm trying to get that.
If they have to start up.
No.
it was £100. I practically like my boots. I would put on my boots and it was a
Yeah,
bonus. Like every time I move on my whole
Your last.
If it was like that way, I doesn't mean it's going to take I really thought
Really all I got.
That's up to you, right? This is how you decide what you want to do. And part of that has to do with thinking down the road further. What you want to do with your career. And how do you want to gain the skills that you're going to need in order to pursue that?
No,
Yeah, I'm now here as a positive person because I'm it's not part of the
That could look like all kinds of different things. So you have to decide what.
Sleeping that bed was challenging. You used to like sleep here and wake up at 3 and climb back down.
Like $1 million in this room.
Yeah, but you go to the website. What would your next PA? How do I join?
I remember I half my body was
No, not necessarily. So one of the individuals that comes to the PhD journal clubs regularly is a surgeon who studies there's cancer, neuroscience. You can do overlap. I mean, but it sounds like cancer.
Yeah, I think I met you. You have different booths.
So brain cancer. It's huge. It's a huge problem.
Oh,
So start looking at how you might find a field that would combine all of these.
I would say if she doesn't get
In any given condition that might not be exactly what you want to do now.
Each year.
They make it if it hasn't been done before and it's necessary. The first step we need to do is that's fine.
Actually, we see some. I have so you see
Engineering.
I'm engineering.
Well, it's true that I think part of what looking at these grants might underscore is that the mentor's really important. And it's really important to look at what that intersect with that mentor. Where do they end up going?
to make sure
And